The old part of Savannah, Georgia, in the late 1990s was a city of two faces. By day, it was a postcard of southern charm, with its sun-dappled squares, its graceful weeping willows, and its elegant antebellum mansions. But by night, a different city emerged. A city of deep shadows, of twisting gaslit alleys, of secrets that festered behind wrought iron gates. It was a city that knew how to keep its ghosts. And in the autumn of 1997, a new, terrifying ghost was about to be born. The story began with a disappearance. A young woman named Amy, just 20 years old, worked at a small fabric shop near the city market. On a humid Tuesday evening, she vanished. She had left work at her usual time, her path home a familiar 10-minute walk through a labyrinth of narrow cobblestone alleys. She never made it. Her family, their initial worry slowly curdling into a cold, hard fear, called the police. The initial investigation was routine. The police considered the usual possibilities: a runaway, a jilted lover, a random act of violence. But Amy was a good girl, her family insisted. Quiet, steady. She had no reason to run away. 3 days later, another young woman disappeared. Her name was Beth, 22 years old. She worked as a waitress at a restaurant just a few blocks from where Amy had worked. Her route home also took her through the same shadowy network of alleys. She too vanished without a trace. A cold, creeping fear began to grip the city. 2 young women gone in less than a week. The newspapers started calling him the Shadow of Savannah. The police, led by a weary, veteran detective named Frank Miller, were under immense pressure. The city's charming facade was cracking, revealing a dark, predatory underbelly. Then a third victim. A 19-year-old college student named Lisa. She disappeared after a late-night study session at the university library. The pattern was the same: a young woman walking alone at night, a disappearance so total, so absolute, it was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The investigation was going nowhere. There were no witnesses, no ransom demands, no bodies, just a growing, suffocating cloud of fear. But there was one strange, recurring detail. A few of the victims' friends and colleagues mentioned a strange man who had been seen lurking near their workplaces. The description was vague, inconsistent, but one detail stood out. A co-worker of Beth's, the waitress, remembered seeing a man with strange hands. She described them as calloused and rough, as if they were always covered in a fine layer of black dust, like soot. The description was odd, but it stuck in Detective Miller's mind. It pointed to a man who worked with his hands, someone engaged in a dirty manual trade. He began to focus his investigation on the small, forgotten workshops and artisan studios tucked away in the city's labyrinthine alleys. His intuition led him to a man named Marcus Kane. Kane was 35 years old, the owner of a small, traditional tannery and rendering workshop, a family business that had been in the same spot for over 100 years. It was a grim, anachronistic place, its location near the last known whereabouts of the victims. Kane was a recluse, a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself. His record was clean. He seemed an unlikely suspect. But secret surveillance revealed a pattern of deeply suspicious behavior. In the dead of night, Kane would be seen moving heavy burlap sacks from his workshop, loading them onto a small boat and heading out into the dark, murky waters of the Savannah River. And after these nocturnal trips, a strange, dense black smoke would be seen billowing from the tall brick chimney of his workshop. The smoke carried a smell, a foul, pungent, unnatural odor. It wasn't the smell of burning animal hides, it was something else. A nauseating mix of roasted meat and harsh chemicals. A smell, one of the surveillance officers wrote in his report, that did not belong to this world. A smell, he wrote, like a devil escaping from an earthly hell. The first break in the case came from a local fisherman. He had snagged his net on a heavy waterlogged sack at the bottom of the river. When he hauled it up, it tore open, spilling its contents onto the deck of his boat. Ashes and small, charred bone fragments. They didn't look entirely like animal bones. He called the police. Forensic analysis confirmed their worst fears. Some of the fragments were human, specifically from the small, delicate bones of the hands and feet. They had been burned at an incredibly high temperature. Armed with a warrant, Miller and his team descended on Marcus Kane's workshop. The place was a chaotic jumble of tools, hides, and vats of chemicals. It smelled of death and decay, but it was the smell of animal death, a smell that was normal for a place like this. At the back of the workshop they found a locked door. Kane tried to dismiss it as a simple storage room, but Miller's instincts screamed at him. He ordered the door to be forced open. The room inside was small and windowless. The air was foul, despite a fresh layer of lime powder that had been scattered on the floor, a clear attempt to conceal a deeper, more persistent stench. A forensics technician, sweeping the room with a black light, found them. Tiny, almost invisible bloodstains on the floorboards and the walls, and on the floor near a drain, she found a single long black hair and a small flower-shaped white plastic button. The button was the key. It was identical to one that had been on the jacket Amy, the first victim, had been wearing on the day she disappeared. They finally had a concrete link between Marcus Kane and one of the missing women. DNA testing later confirmed that the bloodstains in the room belonged to Amy. The horror, however, was just beginning. Behind a false wall in the back of the storage room, they discovered a hidden passage. It led down a set of narrow stone steps into a damp, dark, secret basement. The smell that rose from the darkness was a thing of pure, unadulterated evil. It was a smell that would haunt the dreams of every officer who was there that day. The basement was a scene from a medieval torture chamber. Iron chains hung from the ceiling. Ropes and strange, cruel-looking tools lay scattered on the floor. There were large plastic containers filled with unknown chemicals, and in the center of the room there was a large brick furnace. Its design was unique, different from the normal furnaces used for rendering animal carcasses. The inside was coated with a thick, dark, greasy residue that emitted that same horrifying smell of burnt meat and chemicals. Scattered throughout the basement, like the discarded refuse of a monstrous feast, were the personal belongings of women. Hair clips, torn pieces of clothing, a single high-heeled shoe, a broken silver chain. It was a graveyard of lost lives. The most damning evidence of all was found in a worn, leather-bound notebook on a small, dusty table. It was Kane's journal, but it wasn't a diary of his thoughts and feelings. It was a meticulous, cold-blooded record of his work, a logbook of horror. It detailed his ingredients, his cooking times, his methods for achieving the highest quality product. He wrote in a chilling, metaphorical language, referring to his victims as fresh ingredients, noting that the more they struggle, the better the essence. A single, shocking entry written in red ink revealed the core of his madness. It was a quote from a twisted, apocryphal text. A sick belief that a mythical elixir, a substance he called the bloom of expansion, required the souls of young women aged 18 to 25. He believed that the more they suffered, the more they struggled, the more potent their life force would be, and the stronger the essence he could distill from their bodies. The horrifying truth was finally revealed. Marcus Kane's workshop was not a tannery. It was a human slaughterhouse. He was not just a killer. He was a monster, a modern-day alchemist attempting to create a divine medicine from the ashes of the innocent. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence from his own private hell, Marcus Kane's calm, reclusive facade crumbled. He confessed. He told them everything. He admitted to being obsessed with ancient legends of an elixir of life, an ambrosia made from human essence. His motive was a twisted, narcissistic desire for a kind of godhood. He believed that by processing his victims, by consuming their distilled life force, he could absorb their youth, their vitality. He could achieve a twisted form of immortality. He described his methods with a disturbing, clinical detachment. He would stalk young women in the dark, deserted alleys of the city. He would use his strength, or sometimes chloroform, to subdue them. He would drag them back to his workshop, to the secret basement where he would imprison them. He would torture them, both physically and mentally, for days, sometimes weeks, before the final horrific act of putting them into the furnace. His description of their suffering, of their pleas for mercy, was delivered without a flicker of remorse. He spoke of it as a necessary step in his great work. Psychological experts who later evaluated him diagnosed him with a severe antisocial personality disorder with malignant, narcissistic, and sadistic traits. He was a man completely devoid of empathy, a man who saw other human beings not as people, but as raw materials for his own sick, grandiose fantasies. He also confessed to a previous failed abduction attempt years earlier in another state. His obsession, they realized, was a long-standing, deep-seated madness. He described how he had disposed of the remains, scattering them in different parts of the Savannah River, burying some in remote sections of the coastal forests. His confession led to the identification of at least 2 more victims, besides Amy, Beth, and Lisa. A silver bracelet with a strange, occult symbol found in the basement did not belong to any of the identified victims. It was a chilling suggestion that there were even more unknown victims, their fates forever a secret, their ashes scattered to the wind and the water. He spoke of his ritual, a bizarre, horrifying mix of traditional rendering techniques, macabre legends, and his own sick, sexual fantasies. He believed that through this process he could not only capture his victims' life force, but their very souls, refining their power into his twisted elixir. He spoke of Lisa, his last victim, with a strange, almost reverent tone. He said she had been strong, defiant, that she had fought him to the very end. Her defiance, he said, had only excited his beastly nature, leading him to inflict even more brutal tortures upon her. And then came the most terrifying revelation of all. Cain mentioned a client, a wealthy, powerful, and very sick man who had heard of Cain's work through shadowy underground channels. This man had ordered a large quantity of the bloom of expansion at an exorbitant price. He believed it could cure his terminal illness. This opened up the horrifying possibility of a hidden network, a secret society of depraved, wealthy individuals who were willing to pay for this monstrous product. The investigation into the wealthy client proved to be a dead end. The man was cunning, protected by a wall of money and influence, but the information was recorded, a loose thread in a tapestry of evil that might never be fully unraveled. Acting on a hunch, Miller's team discovered another property owned by Cain, a hidden, remote house deep in the swamp, an address he had never declared. It wasn't another crime scene, it was a storage facility, a larder of horrors. Inside, they found dozens of sealed ceramic jars neatly arranged on shelves like a collection of fine wines. Each jar contained a thick, dark, gelatinous substance, the bloom of expansion. The quantity was staggering. It represented far more victims than they had identified, and on a shelf they found another notebook. This one contained a list of names or nicknames corresponding to each jar. The dancer, the singer, the weeping girl. Next to each name were chilling, brief notes on their characteristics, their struggles, and Cain's own sick, twisted feelings during the commission of his atrocities. It was a meticulous, obsessive catalogue of his monstrous work. The public's reaction to the full, gruesome details of the case was a tidal wave of shock and outrage. The story of the Savannah alchemist and his human essence factory was a national sensation. The demand for justice was a deafening roar. In a final, eerie meeting with Detective Miller before his trial, Marcus Cain remained unrepentant. His calm, cold demeanor never wavered. He hinted that the police still didn't fully understand the true nature of his great work. He spoke again of his twisted belief in achieving a kind of immortality. He even mentioned that his wealthy client had been eager to learn his secret art, implying that his criminal, cannibalistic ideology had the potential to spread like a virus. Marcus Cain was sentenced to death for multiple counts of abduction, rape, and serial murder with extreme cruelty. Justice, in its own slow, methodical way, had been served. But for the families of his victims, the pain and trauma would be a life sentence. The case of the bloom of expansion became an indelible black stain on the history of Savannah. It was a nightmare from which the city would never fully awaken. It served as a painful, horrifying lesson about the depths of human depravity, about the evil that can fester behind a mask of quiet normalcy. It was a reminder that even in the most beautiful, charming of places, the most terrifying monsters are not the ghosts of the past. They are the living, breathing men who walk among us. The fate of the wealthy client, however, remained a chilling, unresolved question. A stark reminder that sometimes the reach of justice is not long enough to touch the powerful, and that some monsters, the ones with money and influence, are the hardest of all to kill.